Copyright and the computer, regulations governing technology. If we look at the summary of the case and the facts that are established, we see that the who established is Rural St. Regis School. There are 420 students, and those are in grades K through 8. There's a PTA that is involved, and then we have Mr. Keith Sample, who's our principal. Mrs. Lynn, she is our library and media specialist, and she will also be the computer teacher. There's Mrs. Williams, one third grade teacher, and Mrs. Brandon, the other third grade teacher. When we look at the facts of what is established in this case, financial support, there's a meager state allocation, and then of course there's 2 major fundraisers that the school does every year. There's an annual budget, and basic materials for the teachers are bought with that budget. And then there's a small bit of extra money that the school uses for new software or computers, and it's decided upon each year by the principal and the teachers. Mr. Sample was part of the school for several years. However, because he wasn't in the school originally, he's worked to establish the positive relationships that he has with the teachers and the community, and he's worked very diligently to do that. For the last 3 years, the PTA and the school, they agreed to use the extra money to buy computers. So when they bought those computers, they now have a new computer lab, and they have those 20 new computers that were purchased. So then Mrs. Lynn worked really hard. She worked with teachers and Mr. Sample, and they have now aligned new software with instructional objectives, and they have purchased that new software for those 20 new computers. A common goal established was to purchase this new software for the next couple of years in order to make good use of the computers that they purchased. All but 3 of the teachers used the new lab and the computers very frequently on a regular basis. After 4 months of computer lab use, several teachers went to Mrs. Lynn. She was also, of course, the computer lab teacher then at that point. And they had an idea of how to use the software on a bigger scale. They wanted to supplement their classroom activities with the use of their individual computers in their classrooms. So the teachers had asked Mrs. Lynn to make copies of the new computer software so that they could put that on their classroom computers. Because this would increase the use of new software for more students, Mrs. Lynn purchased several blank CDs and copied the new software for each teacher to install on their classroom computers. Mrs. Lynn made copies despite copyright restrictions that govern the reproduction of the multiple copies. And she did that without, of course, the permission from the author, without any additional licenses. Mrs. Brandon was extremely grateful, but she did express that she had concern to Mrs. Lynn about violating copyright laws. This made Mrs. Lynn very upset, and Mrs. Brandon reported these concerns and the incident to Mr. Sample. Mr. Sample did speak with Mrs. Lynn about the situation and told her that she needed to collect all the CDs and not put the software on the classroom computers. Mrs. Lynn indicated she was upset by this and that the PTA and the community would be really happy with the way that she was extending the use of the money and the new software. Everything that has occurred, it occurred at the St. Regis School in grades K through 8 during the school year, and it was about 4 months into the school year. If we look at legal and ethical uses, there are going to be some legal violations for copyright, legal violations that are possible for teacher licensure, ethical violations with the students who may have witnessed what has been going on with the teachers in the copyright situation, ethical violations for the teachers in the copyright themselves, ethical violations in professionalism, and ethical violations because of the possible lies that have occurred. So we look at the legal violations. Technology makes it easier than ever to reproduce any and all of materials. So it's imperative for educators and students to be sure to do so legally and ethically. Because it's become so easy to infringe upon these rights, there are now some watchdog groups that have been created in order to monitor for any type of infringement. If you add this to the fact that the copyright is a legal concept with the possibility of legal consequences, it has become really important, more important than probably ever, for educators, educational administrators, and the students to not only be aware, but to exercise these rights and precautions through well established habits in order to prevent any issues with copyright infringement and to make sure we don't violate those laws. In addition to fair use and Creative Commons, educators need to also be aware of and consider some of the baseline rules of procedure to guide copyright practices. And some of these rules that have to be considered consist of educators being able to make copies of the articles, maps, charts, etc. And they can do that as long as the student copies are made at a one copy per student rate, but permission has to be granted to have any type of extended limits or any type of repeated instances with these. Neither educators nor administrators are allowed to direct colleagues or staff to make copies of the copyrighted protected materials. And so this is one place where we're going to see one of those violations is that we see that some of that directing is going on by other educators in the building. Educators are not allowed to copy the same copyright protected material from year to year or from term to term without permission. And although this wasn't happening every single year, it was happening on a repetitive basis. Educators are not allowed to charge students for copies. This was not happening, but of course, we want to make sure that that does not happen. Audio tapes and videotapes are allowed to be played, but it has to directly relate to the lesson. Unless permission is obtained, audio and video cannot be played for purely purposes of entertainment or reward in the classroom. And there is a limited use of copyright-protected multimedia materials that may be used in the classroom. Now we start to see some of these rules and laws come into play in this particular case. Non-dramatic literary works may be used. Internet materials used with original works by students and teachers may be displayed online with permission, of course. Web pages are not allowed to be copied or edited to make them for personal repost or reprint. And then finally, computer software may be used to make backup copies, and single backup copies of computer documentation may also be made. The software cannot be networked unless it is already licensed for networking. The normally limited number of licenses cannot be exceeded, and that's where we start to see some real issues with this particular case and some legal violations that were made. Okay, so we look at the legal violations as far as teacher licensure could be concerned. For some teachers in some states, a legal copyright violation could also result in legal ramifications for teachers' licenses. A licensed professional, such as teachers, they have a duty and an obligation to abide by all laws, to maintain a professional demeanor, and to make ethical decisions for the well-being and success of all students and all stakeholders in education. And if the laws are violated, there are times when a teacher's license is going to be at risk as well. Okay, we have ethical violations and students maybe witnessing the copyright violations, and that becomes an ethical violation. So even though many teachers don't realize how observant students really are, most students realize and know the issues that occur with teachers, between teachers, to teachers. It also sets a poor example for students to know exactly what copyright laws are and how they apply to education, how they apply to our teachers, how do they apply to students. Teachers need to be an example and set forth the regular laws and regulations that are expected of them for students to learn and for students to abide by these at all times. Ethical violations may have been violated as far as the teachers and the copyright laws. So, copyright infringement or any violations at all are not just legal issues, but this also becomes an ethical issue for teachers. So, in turn, administrators also have an issue then that comes about because they are the leaders of these teachers. It's important for teachers to also be leaders when it comes to laws and ethics in order to be effective examples for young and first year teachers, as well as for all students involved. For professionalism, there are professional standards and boundaries that exist in all careers and professions. Moreover, when these standards and boundaries are violated or crossed at all, it creates a huge breach in this professionalism, and it can have harmful effects on all stakeholders, especially when it comes to young people and students. In this particular case, the actions of Mrs. Lynn could have harmful effects on the district, on the community, but more importantly, it's going to have harmful effects on the students. And if Mr. Sample is not careful with his reactions and his decisions as a leader, it's possible that he might also create harmful violations in professionalism that would have huge consequences, as well as any consequences already shown through Mrs. Lynn. And then we see ethical violations because the lies that are being told as far as the actual ethics violations with the laws that are broken. Because Mrs. Lynn does not want to take back all of the CDs that have already been copied, it is possible she might lie about the copies made. Basically, it's not a huge big deal. We're not going to tell anybody. If nobody knows, nobody gets hurt. This could be a direct ethics violation in addition to the legal violation that's already been made. It's possible she may also want the principal and others to also lie in order to maintain the illegally copied software for all of the computers in the classrooms. This not only hurts the school, but it's also going to hurt the teachers, the students, and the community. It will also hurt the credibility of the school and the relationships that have been hard work to create and fostered in the school district, especially through the principal who hasn't been there very long. So now if we look at the actual synthesis, we see that due to a lack of leadership or knowledge, and in this whole entire case, there is a lack of knowledge. And due to this lack of knowledge through copyright laws, as well as other policies and regulations, Mr. Sample is going to need to lead by example and take full ownership of his decisions. And he's going to have to do this in order to create change and effectively and creatively instate change for the better and more fully enhance the educational culture and environment in his building for the entire well-being and future success of all of the stakeholders. But most of all, that includes each and every student. If we look at a synthesis of the facts of all that is known, when we look at the people, Mr. Sample, what do we know? He's the principal. He was not aware of the copyright violations until made aware by Mrs. Brandon. He has asked Mrs. Lynn to not continue to make copies of the software and to gather all copies already illegally made. He's treading lightly due to the fact that because he's not from the area, he's had to work really, really hard to create and foster some positive relationships. And he's done so with the staff as well as the community as the educational leader. What do we know about Mrs. Lynn? Well, she's a library media specialist. She worked with teachers and Mr. Sample to make a prioritized list of the software programs that would be aligned to the instructional objectives and curriculum for the school. And because the school is very small, they did not have a computer lab until recently. And because of that, they did not have a computer lab teacher. So when the software arrived, Mrs. Lynn was then put in charge of the computer lab as the teacher. She created a lab schedule, and all teachers, except 3 of them, used the lab consistently. And when the other teachers told her that they wanted to use the new software for a supplemental resource in their classrooms, Mrs. Lynn did not ask any questions or seek any advice that we know of. She simply purchased the blank CDs and made copies of the software for the teachers to use in their classrooms. Now, Mrs. Brandon did not wish to have a copied disc. This really upset Mrs. Lynn, and her reply to Mrs. Brandon became very unprofessional. Now, Mrs. Williams is the other third grade teacher. She has accepted and was excited to receive a copy of the software for her classroom. She's experienced, but she's always taught at St. Regis and she's never had any experience anywhere else. Mrs. Brandon, third grade teacher, she did not accept the copy of the software. And what we know is that she was just not comfortable with the copies that were made. And she learned about and was aware of all of the copyright laws that she needed to be aware of from the district in which she used to teach. She approached Mr. Sample, about the whole situation, and she made him aware of what was going on. And then we also know that Mrs. Evans is the PTA president, and she has helped Mrs. Lynn make the copies of the software. And she appears to be unaware of the copyright laws and the regulations, as well as any ramifications that could occur because of the violations. Now, the program is a K-8 program, and the new software is aligned to the curriculum and all of the instructional objectives. It is being used to maximize all the efforts for any of the study units in the building. What do we know about the place? Well, it's St. Regis. It is a rural community. It's 25 miles from any city anywhere. Anybody over 8th grade is bused to the nearest high school. There are only 2 grocery stores, there's 1 drugstore, and there's a few other small businesses, but it is a very small town. There are small town intricacies and small town attitude and foresight. What do we not know when we synthesize the facts? Well, the unknown about this whole situation, as far as the people are concerned, Mr. Sample, it's unknown whether or not he has had proper training with copyright laws. It's also unknown if he stresses these laws as important with his staff in his building. Moreover, it'd be helpful to know if Mr. Sample has been monitoring the output of the new software and its uses to understand and decide if it is effective, whether or not that they use the money properly, etc. With Mrs. Lynn, for this particular case, it's unknown if Mrs. Lynn has had any proper training in copyright laws at all, or if she's had any training in computer software. Although she is trained in media, it is unknown what this does and does not include. Also unknown are any connections Mrs. Lynn has to the community members, especially with the PTA. Does she have any types of connections politically? Because she's taken on a role that is more leadership-based, she has also shown that she should have had some sort of leadership development, but it's unclear as if she's had any type of training in this or not. Mrs. Williams also, she's been at the school for her entire career. It's been the same school. She could be hindering her own capabilities as an educator without broadening her spectrum into any other schools. And if St. Regis is not fostering any new knowledge for her, this could also be an issue, but this is not known. Mrs. Brandon, it's not known if there have been prior issues between her and Mrs. Lynn. It is also not known if she has had any leadership training or training on how to deal with conflict in the workplace. Mrs. Evans. There's very little known about Mrs. Evans, except we do know that she is the president of the PTA. And it would be helpful to know what her career occupation is in accordance with the community, as well as if she has any tight connections in politics and any other manner within the community. For the program itself, it's unknown how much parents are really involved. The effective nature of the software program that has been chosen is unknown. And we do not know the historical academic achievement and any of the standards that have met or not met. State of the academics at the high school in which all of the students are going to feed into is unknown, and that would be important. As far as the place is concerned, what we do not know, the unknowns are the rate of diversity. How diverse is this community? Is there a lot of political weight held over education? Are there political ties to the community? Is there a lot of political clout? What are the customs and norms in the community? Is it a very traditional town? Is it a very traditionally small town minded area? And what are the economic conditions? So if we look at a review of the information, we know the conflict in the situation as it is could potentially be damaging to the educators, the stakeholders, and the community as a whole. Those who have an important stake in the outcome include all of the educators, all of the leaders, and all of the community members. And this is going to include members of the business community as well. It's going to be very important to notify all of the stakeholders involved in the situation and possible ramifications in order to avoid future issues of the same nature. It's also going to be important so that you can avoid any type of lawsuits or litigation that may come down the pike. Although more information could be obtained to make a better informed decision, there is enough information at this point to make a sound decision as it stands. There is enough information and enough known about the issue to make a decision right now at this point. What options could be identified and what could the possible consequences be? When we look at ideas and options that could be identified, when making decisions as a leader, it's imperative to weigh and consider several options. In this particular scenario, there are several ways in which a situation can be handled, and there are several options to take into consideration. We could take no action. There is a possibility for liberal and comprehensive strategy. There is a possibility for intermediary action. This would be at a minimum. And then there's a possibility for intermediary action with more extensive areas that could be involved. So if we take no action, if we leave everything as it is after instructing Mrs. Lynn to gather all copies and to not make any more, leave the issue as it is and simply allow it to dissipate on its own, there are some possible consequences. This could result in further issues between Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon and create a bigger problem. It could also result in further issues of copyright and other policy violations, especially if action is not taken. It could be seen as a green light, per se, to violate or break other policies, laws, and regulations within the district. This could also result in the company learning of the violation, and if they learn of that violation, they could take some legal action against the school and the district. And this leaves future years with a much lower budget and a much lower pool of money to work with because of the litigation that has come from the decision. This would devastate the future well-being and success of all students. Or possibly it could just result in no further issues, and it could simply just dissipate on its own, and it could, just as intended, just go away. If we look at the liberal and comprehensive strategy, what this would entail would be to have a conversation with Mrs. Lynn, let her know that it's okay to hand out the copies, and go ahead and just continue to make as many copies as needed. They could let her know that she could even, if she wanted to, go as far as to make one copy per student to send home with the students so that they could use those at home with their computers. And then this would also entail to have a conversation with Mrs. Brandon, let her know that while the superintendent at her old school may have been really strict about those copyright laws and policies, it's just different here at St. Regis. It's a small community, it's very close-knit, and so there aren't going to be any issues. There are no issues to be expected. If this strategy is used, the possible consequences are that this could potentially have disastrous effects. This could lead to more issues between Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon, as well as other staff members. And it could possibly be that students could see that's what's going on, and they would break other policies or laws as well. This could be a floodgate or Pandora's box for anyone who wishes to never follow any protocol, policy, regulations, or laws, and it could result in the company learning of the violation. If the company learns of this violation and takes legal action against the school and the district, this is going to leave future years with much lower budget money and any type of pool of money because of the litigation. This would devastate the future well-being and success of all of the students, and it would ultimately adversely affect all of the staff members and the leaders. But most of all, it's going to greatly impact the students' well-being and future success, and it's going to be in an adverse and negative way. Another possible consequence is that it simply lays dormant for a very long time, and it continues to foster and brew for years to come. But eventually, this is a volcano that will erupt, and it will happen probably sooner than later. If we look at the intermediary action, at a minimum, this action would be to set up a meeting to discuss the situation with both Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon and discuss the copyright laws and the district policy as it pertains to copyright and the consequences of these actions. It would also be to discuss with these ladies the impact it's going to have on the students, their well-being, and their future success. Part of this action would be then to ask Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon to put together and provide a professional learning experience for the rest of the staff so that everyone is informed of the copyright laws and the district policies that should be followed on a regular basis, as well as any consequences if these are not followed. The possible consequences of this scenario. This could very well end with a positive outcome that lays a foundation for better communication for all stakeholders, as well as educate many people who actually need these lessons on policy. It could also prevent any disastrous outcomes now or in the future for all stakeholders, including the students involved. This could also set a precedent for future decisions made in regard to software or any other purchases that are made for the benefit of students in academics and the future success of the school district as a whole. Or another possible consequence is it could all just blow up in the face of leadership. It could have an adverse effect on the school culture, the future policy, and the future well-being and success of all the students. It is also possible that despite last-ditch efforts to reform the actions of staff members, it could result in the company of learning of the violations that happened and take legal action against the school and the district. This then, of course, would leave a much lower budget and pool of money due to the litigation that has happened with this company, and it would devastate the future well-being and success of all of the students. If we look at a more extensive approach with intermediary action, this would involve setting up a meeting to discuss the situation with both Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon. It would include the district attorney for the school district. They would discuss the copyright laws and district policy as it pertains to copyright and the consequences of all of these actions. Additionally, with the help of Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon, they would put together a committee and they would consider a schedule, and they would schedule a community meeting as well. With the committee that Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon have put together with the help of course leadership, they would provide a professional learning experience for the rest of the staff, the committee, and they would put together a separate unit lesson for each grade level for the students as well. And ultimately, this would also be a professional learning experience for the community. So everyone is informed of the copyright laws and the district policies that should be followed, as well as the consequences of what would happen if it's not followed. They would need to make sure that the attorney for the school district is present to answer any questions or so that he or she can make any clarifications. They would have to be sure to indicate the impact, as it will have an impact on the entire community and the businesses in town as well. Most of all, they need to have a section that pertains to the impact it has on the students and their well-being, their future success, and of course, all the stakeholders overall. Possible consequences of this particular action. This could very well end with a very positive outcome that lays a foundation for better communication among all stakeholders, as well as educate many people who need these lessons on policy. It can also prevent any disastrous outcomes now or in the future for all the stakeholders, including the students involved. It could also set a precedent for future decisions made in regard to software or other purchases made for the benefit of the students, for academics and the future success of the school. It could also further bridge gaps between the leadership and the staff. And this could lay the foundation for all of the stakeholders and the future success of all students. Or a possible consequence could be that it does all blow up in the face of everyone, especially the leaders in this district. And it could have adverse effects on the school culture, future policy, and any future well-being and success. It is also possible that despite that last-ditch effort for reform of any actions of staff members, this could result in the company still learning of the violations and taking legal action against the school and the district, and leaving future years with a much lower budget and pool of money because of that litigation that's been involved. And of course, this would really hurt the future well-being and student or success of all of these students, and of course, all of the stakeholders involved. So after looking at all of the options and the possible consequences, you have to evaluate options before making any very serious decisions. So you're going to have pros that come of decisions made, and you're going to have cons. And there are always pros and cons to all decisions that are made or not made, as well as in the manner in which they are made or not made. It is imperative to weigh these for each decision made in order to understand the future outcome and any consequences of these decisions and actions. So if we look at the pros of all of these particular actions, if we take no action, no one else becomes upset. Leadership drew a line, but they didn't have to really rock the boat any. There's no more needless time that will be spent as a referee so that leadership can actually use their time more efficiently and effectively. For the liberal strategy, the pros, no one else is going to become upset. Leadership drew that line but didn't have to rock the boat. No more needless time spent as a referee, and leadership can use their time more efficiently and effectively. And if the company does discover the violation, then the staff members will learn their lesson the hard way. For the intermediate action, for the minimum, the pros, we see the foundation for better communication for all stakeholders. Education will be provided for many people who actually really need these lessons on policy. They'll be able to prevent any disastrous outcomes now or in the future for stakeholders, and that would include the students as well. It's going to set a precedent for future decisions made in regard to software or any other purchases that are made for the benefit of the students, academics, and the future success of the school and the district. And it's going to save the school some money and the district as a whole from any type of lack of lawsuits that may happen. But if we look at a more extensive approach, we see that there's going to be a positive outcome that lays a foundation for better communication for all stakeholders. It's going to educate people who need these lessons on policy. It'll prevent disastrous outcomes now or in the future for everybody involved, and that's including our students. It's going to set a precedent for future decisions made, and that's going to be for software or any other purchases made for the benefit of students, academics, future success of the school, district. It could further bridge any gaps between leadership and staff. This could lay foundation for future cooperation in decision making, and this is done by setting examples. It's going to show us a more positive professional culture for everyone involved. And it's going to be beneficial for the well-being of all stakeholders and the future success of all students involved. If we look at the cons of no action, this is going to result in the company learning of the violation, and then the company will take legal action. It's going to leave the school district less money for future years, a much lower budget, and it's going to devastate the future well-being and success of all of the students in the building, as well as all the other stakeholders involved. If we look at our liberal and comprehensive strategy, the cons, this could have potentially disastrous effects. It'll lead to more issues between Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon, as well as other staff members. And it could possibly also affect the students who would begin to also break policies and laws. This could be the floodgate or Pandora's box. And once it's opened, anyone who wishes to never follow protocol or policy or regulation or laws or any of the above, that would take place with this floodgate. The result in the company learning of the violation could happen. And if it does, of course, this company would most likely take legal action against the school and against the district. And this would leave future years with a lower budget due to this litigation. There are devastating future well-being and success for all of the students, for all the stakeholders, and there would be adverse effects for all of the staff members, all of the leaders, and it would greatly impact students' well-being, as well as greatly impact the future success in a very negative and adverse way. If we look at our intermediary action, at a minimum, the cons would be that this blows up for all the leaders and produces adverse effects on school culture, future policy, and the future well-being and success of all the students and stakeholders. There would be a last-ditch effort to reform the action of the staff members, but this would, of course, result in the company learning of the violation and taking legal action against the school. This leaves a smaller budget for future years, and it would be devastating to the future well-being of all stakeholders, and that includes our students. If we look at a more extensive approach, the cons are going to be that it can blow up in the face of leadership, and it can have those adverse effects on the school and future policy, as well as the future well-being and success of all the students and other stakeholders. The last-ditch efforts to reform the actions of the staff members, this could result in the company, again, learning of their violation and taking action against the school and against the district. And this would leave a very small budget for future years due to the litigation. And this would just be devastating for the future well-being of not just the school and the stakeholders, but of course the students. Once we've created these options, we've seen the possible consequences and the pros and cons of these particular options. It's a time to decide as a leader the best option, the best approach, the best strategy. So under the circumstances presented, the best option for a decision in this case is going to be the intermediary action with the more extensive measures. This can easily be implemented with great care and attention to everyone involved, to all stakeholders, and for the benefit of everybody at the school and in the district. A short consultation of all stakeholders would need to take place, and this is the best, most creative, and beneficial option for everyone involved. This option is going to reap the most benefits with the least possible negative consequences. It is key to note that in the future, when new software arrives, it's going to be imperative for all stakeholders to undergo training and to have a full grasp of the usage of laws, policies, personal abilities, and the ability to deal with the decision made on the new educational tools. And this can be done, of course, through training procedures. And it would be important for everyone to go through those training procedures before full implementation takes effect. To implement the decision that has been made, there needs to be a plan of action. And with this plan of action, we would see that there would need to be a meeting with Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon. During this meeting, establish a committee and, of course, pull the school attorney into this meeting for educational conversation. And then send Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon for professional training themselves. And then after receiving that professional training, they need to establish a community meeting and establish that committee. It'll be important to monitor Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon as they prepare a professional learning experience for staff, for students, and for the community members. It'll be important to seek advice and any needed help from the superintendent in order to be a better leader for the teachers and the other stakeholders. It'll be important to seek advice and any needed help from anybody else besides the superintendent as well. Though Mr. Sample is going to need to make sure that everyone involved understands the adverse effects and consequences that can occur if the issues are not resolved. And if this plan of action does not work in some capacity, it would need to be scaled back and revert back to the minimum version of one and the same in this action. With all of these, it is clear to see that with this particular case and the facts established, the best option as a leader has been made through synthesis, strategy, evaluation, and a decision made for implementation.